Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. This event will be provided in both English and Spanish. So before we begin the content of our presentation, I'd like to give our interpreter, Emily, a moment to speak to our Spanish speakers in the audience and provide instruction for accessing her live interpretation.
Bienvenidos a todos para la presentación de esta noche. Mi nombre es Emily y estoy aquí para proveer servicios de interpretación en español. Si usted desea acceder a la función de interpretación cuando se enciende en un momentico, simplemente ubícase al fondo de su pantalla y ahí presione sobre el globo y escoge Spanish cuando suben los nombres de los idiomas. Y si se están conectando tras un celular, simplemente empuje los 3 puntos y ahí escoge Interpretation, pues Spanish, pues finalmente Done. Muchísimas gracias. Y también quiero decir que cuando hay un periodo de Q y A para preguntas y contestas al final de la presentación, simplemente cuando le surge una pregunta, la puede escribir dentro de la sección que dice Q y A, y al final de la presentación el presentador contestaría sus preguntas, tiempo permitiendo. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Emily. And my name is Crystal Edwards. I'm a programmer for the Central Arkansas Library System. Our presentation tonight is part of the series Literary Bridges, Puentes Literarios Arkansas-Mexico, a partnership between the Central Arkansas Library System and the Mexican Consulate in Little Rock to encourage cultural exchange and bilingual interaction amongst our patrons. We are honored to partner with the Mexican Consulate for this series. I also want to give thanks to Maria Aguilar for her hard work organizing and promoting this series. Presenting tonight, Dr. Antonio Tony Zavaleta is native of Brownsville, Texas, and a member of a pioneer family residing on the US-Mexico border since 1600. He received a doctoral degree in anthropology in 1976 from the University of Texas and has spent the last 45 years studying the US-Mexico border. He is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and Sociology at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, and a member of the Board of Trustees of Texas Southmost College. Dr. Zavaleta is internationally renowned for studying population growth and urban development, poverty, immigration, and many other border topics, including most notably health disparities. He has studied folk healers known as curanderos and shaman throughout Mexico and has published numerous books and articles on shamanism and the plants of the borderlands. His most recent publication is Curandero, Ethnopsychotherapy, and Curanderismo, Hispanic Mental Health in the 21st Century. Dr. Zavaleta was awarded the prestigious Order of the Otli, a Nahuatl word meaning pathfinder, by Mexico, the highest award given to a non-Mexican citizen. He received this award for his 45 years of study and defense of Mexicans living abroad in the United States. It's an honor and a pleasure to have him here with us tonight. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat and we will get to them after the lecture. Please give a warm virtual lecture to Dr. Zavaleta presenting How French Intervention Changed Mexican History.
Thank you very much, Crystal, and Maria and Emily. I'm very honored to be invited to speak to you today by my dear friends, the Honorable Rodolfo Quilantan and his wife, Patricia, Mexican Consul at Little Rock, Arkansas, and formerly of Brownsville, Texas. I've been asked to clarify the misunderstanding that often exists surrounding the Battle of Puebla, more commonly known as the Cinco de Mayo, which took place on the 5th of May, 1862. Most people in the United States do not understand what it represents or commemorates. In fact, even this evening when I was watching my local news broadcast in the valley, in Rio Grande Valley here, the news contact had a dancing maraca. You can imagine the horror with which I saw that image. Most North Americans simply think that the Cinco de Mayo is a day to have some guacamole and a beer and nachos and a fiesta. But it's important, I think, and that's why I'm here today, to talk about what exactly it represents. The 159th anniversary of the battle is tomorrow and is celebrated in Puebla, but not many other places in Mexico because it's not an official Mexican holiday. I also want to thank the Central Arkansas Library Systems program, Literary Bridges, Arkansas, Mexico, partnership between Central Arkansas Library System and the Mexican Council. It's marvelous. Thank you for this opportunity. I speak to you today from the historic Fort Brown, the first fort built on the US-Mexico border. Today, the home of Texas Southmost College, and you can see a representation of the fort as it existed around 1900 or so. It was actually built after the Mexican-American War in 1848. I want to thank all who have zoomed in for this discussion, including my friends from Brownsville, if there are any. I won't be using any graphics in this presentation today because it's more valuable, I think, use of time to hear the words and the concepts, and the graphics simply, in my mind, detract from that. There are plenty of maps and other material on the internet you can look up if you're interested. The Battle of Puebla was fought between Mexico and the invading French army beginning in 1862. Today in Puebla, today and tomorrow, there's a celebration of the battle with a huge fiesta and especially a reenactment in which people are dressed in the uniforms, Mexican and French uniforms. In order to understand the significance of the Battle of Puebla, we must examine the relationship between Mexico and Spain and France and England and the United States during the time between 1820 and the 1870s. We must also understand the geopolitical situation that the United States found itself in those years. The stability of the United States was very shaky, and Great Britain would like to have invaded the United States once again. Spain and France both wanted to invade Mexico. And so it was a very difficult time. In fact, there was a huge division between those people who were considered the conservatives and those who were the liberals. Sounds familiar, right? In fact, our US American General Winfield Scott, after the Battle of Mexico City, which the American Army won, of course, he was asked by the conservatives to stay on as Emperor of Mexico. They were prepared to offer him the emperorship of Mexico. Let's examine the colonial period in Mexico for a bit. In 1820, Mexico won independence from Spain after 300 years of colonial domination from 1520 to 1820. In the early 19th century, Mexico borrowed money from Spain and England and France, and since Mexico was cash poor after their loss in the Mexican-American War, lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War, they were not able to repay their debt to the three lending European nations. Over 3 centuries, Spain, we'll come back to that. Over the 3 centuries, Spain had developed an antiquated and centralized social, political, and religious form of government in New Spain, which exported most of the wealth from Mexico to Spain. These cultural attitudes and beliefs eventually caused Mexico to grow apart from Spain and to seek independence as a nation. The most destructive part of Spain's failure in its system in Mexico, I believe, was the implementation of a caste system, which did not allow persons born in Mexico to have Spaniards born in Mexico to have equal status with those who were born in Spain. Those born in Spain were called peninsulares of the peninsula, while those born in Mexico were the provinciales. There were other smaller but significant groups like the Jewish and Basque communities from which I derive in northern Mexico who held no allegiance to Spain at all. Intermarriage between these groups was common and even desirable for the consolidation of land and wealth. For example, the children of Spaniards born in Mexico were known as criollos and had a lower class status than their brothers and sisters in Spain. This affected both marriage and land rights. The sons and daughters of Spaniards born in Mexico could never have equal class status. This was cause for tremendous consternation and ultimately cause for rebellion. In another custom imported from Spain, the firstborn son inherited all of the family land and wealth. This created a very resentful class of people who desired equality and independence from Spain and were willing to fight for it. Second-born sons were expected to become governmental officials or priests or soldiers, while the daughters were expected to marry or become nuns or live life as spinsters caring for their aging parents. Another failure was Spain's creation of a political system which was centralized in Mexico and that ignored the importance of Mexican provinces. This was Mexico had a tremendous land area which reached from Santa Fe, today New Mexico in the north, to the missions of California in the west and East Texas on the border with Louisiana. Most wealthy Spanish landowners lived in Mexico, however, Mexico City, and not in the provinces where their haciendas and ranchos and mines were located. They were in effect absentee landlords. They were required to have an overlord or a mayordomo, what we call a mayordomo, and other classes of persons living on their haciendas, including peasants, campesinos, and Native Americans in the form of a mission system. The problem was that few soldiers were sent to the provinces which were left largely unprotected. The result was a very weak social and political system that did not concentrate on strengthening or protecting the population and their land holdings outside of the capital. Provincial governments were not protected, therefore. Mission priests were not protected. The failure to protect the missions and priests in New Mexico led to the Pueblo Rebellion of 1680, in which many Spaniards were killed. My ancestor, Father Juan de Zavaleta, escaped from the Pueblo and made it to El Paso del Norte, founding the Zeta mission, where the first Catholic Mass in Texas was celebrated. Moving on to independence. The Mexican War of Independence began with the call to arms, which we refer to as a grito de Dolores, by Father Hidalgo in 1810, which initiated 10 years of bloody conflict ending in the Mexican independence in 1820. If you're wondering where the Battle of Puebla is, just a minute, we're getting there. Therefore, Mexicans' official Independence Day is the 16th of September, 1820. On December 23rd, 1832, moving forward, the leading politicians in Mexico gathered at the family hacienda de Zavaleta in Puebla to ratify an agreement establishing the legitimate president and constitutional order for the country. The War of Independence left Mexico in chaos with little system for the perpetuation of leadership after the exit of Spain, or place where people knew how to govern. They had no experience, that is. For the next 40 years, 1820 to 1860, most leaders were military generals or warlords called caciques. Mexico suffered from one emperor or president after another, and this period was being chaotic. Whomever controlled Mexico City usually controlled the entire nation, because really Mexico City was, for the most part, not connected to the nation except for maybe a few provincial capitals like Chihuahua, Aguascalientes, San Luis Potosí, and so forth. The best known of these generals was the Eighth Santana. We know that name, the 8th president of Mexico, who served in the 1830s, known for his victory over a ragtag group of Texans at the Battle of the Alamo in 1836. What is little known is that a couple of weeks after the Battle of the Alamo, Santa Anna and his army were defeated at the Battle of San Jacinto by Sam Houston and his Texians. An interesting but little known story is that Santa Anna was lined up and about to be executed by a firing squad when he showed General Sam Houston, who was standing right in front of him, a Masonic Brotherhood sign, which caused General Houston to cancel the execution, and Santa Anna was released by his Masonic brother and sent back to Mexico in disgrace. Mexico lost Texas in 1836 under the rule of Santa Anna, and the boundary between Mexico and Texas was drawn at the Nueces River, which is today at Corpus Christi, Texas. In 1845, Texas became part of the United States and Mexico was then invaded. Make no mistake about it. Mexico was invaded and the Mexican-American War was totally planned by the United States as part of its manifest destiny. The war that ensued in 1845 ultimately caused Mexico to lose half of its landmass. The Texas-Mexico border from Brownsville to El Paso, Texas, was drawn up in the Treaty of Guadalupe at the Rio Grande River, where you can see in the background there, where I live, approximately 125 miles south of the Nueces River. The war between the United States and Mexico ended in 1848. From 1848 to 1860, and the French intervention, Mexico floundered without political leadership or direction. The situation worsened. The Mexican Conservative Party longed for the return of a European-style monarchy with an emperor at the head. The opposing Liberal Party sought a democratic form of government with an elected president similar to the United States. In the interim, Mexico's hero President Benito Juarez, a Zapotec from Oaxaca, was elected president of Mexico in 1861 and immediately suspended all payment of foreign debt. And here comes the problem. After the Mexican-American War in 1845, actually it should be 1848, Mexico was broke and was not able to pay its debt. This incensed and encouraged the foreign lenders, England, France, and Spain, to intervene. Seeing Mexico's vulnerability, Spain, France, and England formed a triple alliance, resulting in, first, a military expedition to Mexico and the appropriation of all military and governmental agencies that collected taxes. Secondly, constituted a commission of the three nations that would disburse funds collected in Mexico to repay debt. And thirdly, respect Mexican territory and constitutional government. France decided to topple, actually England and Spain, who had troops in Mexico at Veracruz, withdrew. Spain, on the other hand, France, on the other hand, decided to stay on and topple the weak Juarez government. And in April of 1862, they officially invaded Mexico. The British and Spanish troops, as I said, withdrew. On April 12, 1862, President Benito Juarez announced that Mexico had been invaded by France. The French landed at Veracruz, which is the major port on the coast, was the only port on the coast, preparing to march on Mexico City. There was only one road from the coast, and some of you may know it, from Veracruz up the capital, up steep mountains and through the colonial city of Puebla. That was the only way at that time, the only way to get there. Political, social, and economic instability in Mexico was ongoing between the conservative and the liberal parties. France saw an opportunity to dominate Mexico and thus invited a member of the European royal family, Maximilian of Habsburg, to rule as Emperor of Mexico in 1865. Emperor Napoleon III, the nephew of the original Napoleon, saw the collection of debt as a justification for invasion and the establishment of a puppet government in Mexico. Texas-born General Ignacio Zaragoza Prado Tejano, like I am, was placed in charge of the Mexican army at Puebla to defend the nation. He was a decorated military man, politician, and in line to be president of Mexico. Puebla would be the only line of defense against the French. Once they got past Puebla, it was on easy going on to Mexico City. With little hope of victory, literally little hope of victory, Mexico planned to make its stand on the high ground at Puebla. The French would have to climb a steep hill in their approach to the city, approaching with wagons, cannons, and supply trains. Zaragoza was able to gather a force of approximately 4,000 untrained and undisciplined men, some military men, but mostly peasants, and Mexican and the Indios. I understand Indians with a capital I, of the surrounding tribes joined in to save Mexico. The French general, hero General Lawrence, commanded an army of approximately 6,000 of the best trained soldiers in the world, including Zouaves, a highly decorated light infantry battalion from North Africa. There was no army that compared to the French army of the day. Inaccurate intelligence that had been received by Lawrence from the Conservative Party assured the French commander that the Mexicans would not resist and that were in favor of French rule, but it turned out that that was not true. Of course, the conservatives were in favor of the French. The French army was advised to attack from on the high side of the city to the north, but they chose the easier route to approach from the south. Another mistake. The southern route was through the twin forts which guarded the entrance to Puebla, Guadalupe and Loreto. A fierce day-long battle ensued on May the 5th, in which the French bombarded the rock-solid forts to no avail. Surprisingly, their cannonballs were not able to destroy the forts, even a little bit. The French batteries could not destroy them, and this initial assault failed. The French regathered and struggled up the hill, attacking on 3 successive occasions, taking heavy casualties and expending much of their ammunition. As they approached the top of the hill, the French were met by an army of fierce Zacapoaxtla Indians who had been recruited, who drove the French back down the hill. The French were caught in a devastating crossfire. The Mexican commander Zaragoza assumed the French would attack for a fourth time from the south, and the Mexican army met them head on, and the weakened French were cut to shreds. The majestic French army had been defeated by an army of ragtag soldiers, conscripts, and Indios. The Mexican army had also exhausted much of their ammunition, and the fighting was now hand to hand. As the French prepared for the final assault of the day, they'd been fighting all day from dawn to dusk. A violent spring storm, if you know Mexico, you know that's very typical, came up over the mountains in the evening, the late afternoon and the evening, over the twin volcanoes, and rained and hailed incessantly on the battlefield, made a terrible mess and prevented either army from moving. They couldn't do anything. All credit was given to La Virgen de Guadalupe, to whom the Mexicans had prayed for a miracle, and the French retreated down the hill. It's very similar to the battle of the Spanish against the Moors, in which the St. James, Santiago, is reported to have appeared on his white horse, and the Spanish won that battle. So it happened again in Mexico. And while I'm sure that's myth, urban legend, it makes a good story. The Mexicans assumed the trumpeting was from Gabriel the Archangel and were further invigorated by their miraculous victory, and it was miraculous. After heavy fighting and 4 attempts to take Puebla, the French army was forced to retreat back toward Veracruz and wait for reinforcements. President Benito Juarez and the nation reveled in the victory and honored the various Mexican generals, one of whom was my great-great-grandfather, General Juan Nepomuceno Cortina of Brownsville, Texas, who later became the military governor of the state of Tamaulipas, to the south of Brownsville. The disgraced French commander returned to France in shame, and a new commander was appointed, and thousands of French troops were sent to Mexico. They had been terribly embarrassed. On March 16, 1863, a year later, 38,000 French troops once again attacked Puebla on their way to Mexico City. This is called the Second Battle of Puebla. The Mexicans were able to hold out for 72 days, but were finally defeated. The French defeated Puebla and marched on to Mexico City, where the Conservative Party offered the throne to Maximilian. After the Battle of Puebla, the Mexican combatants were honored, as were the First Battle of Puebla, as were their commanders. The highest accolades were given to General Zaragoza of Texas, who planned the strategies of defense. He led the skirmishes and developed the strategy to defeat the French on the Cinco de Mayo. Zaragoza recognized the arrogance of the French commanders. The Mexicans had defended the sovereignty of their nation against foreign invaders, which is pretty important, seeing as how just a few years earlier they had been defeated by the Americans. 4 months after, tragically, 4 months after the Battle of Puebla, on September 8, 1862, General Zaragoza died of yellow fever and would not become Mexican president. Today, Puebla is a thriving Mexican city which celebrates victory over the French at the First Battle of Puebla every Cinco de Mayo, which is tomorrow. It's celebrated with parades and battle reenactments, and the participants dressed up in Mexican and French uniforms. I've had the pleasure to witness that. But is not for the most part celebrated in other parts of Mexico, as these religious and military celebrations are generally regional. After the Second Battle of Puebla in 1864, Archduke Maximilian of Habsburg was appointed the Emperor of Mexico. The French military upheld the puppet government, his puppet government. He was an idealist with good intentions, all believe, for Mexico, but his short reign lasted only 2 years, and he was executed in 1867 after his cousin Napoleon III withdrew military support from Mexico to support the Franco-German War of 1870. After the execution of the Archduke, his wife, Duchess Carlota, escaped to Europe. 3 years later, the French army was withdrawn from Mexico, not before the army made its way up to the north and to the border with the United States at the Rio Grande River and Matamoros across from Brownsville in 1864. Now you can see another angle coming in. The French army, and I remember relatives, my ancestors telling me about this, the French army was bivouacked along the banks of the Rio Grande River near the coast, waiting to be called into the American Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. There was a naval blockade, but the blockade did not include the mouth of the Rio Grande River, because that would have drawn the French into the war on the Confederate side and most likely would have changed the outcome of the Civil War. Brownsville was a Confederate town and the site of all cotton exportation to Europe, since the river was not part of the naval blockade, as I just said. The United States was fearful of interrupting the peace with European countries. In 1864, the French army had reached the border with Texas, and while at Matamoros, witnessed the Battle of Palmetto Hill. Brownsville, Texas is a very historic place in the sense that the first battle of the Mexican-American War in 1845 was fought at Brownsville, Texas, called the Battle of Palo Alto. And the last battle of the American Civil War was fought at Brownsville, Texas, at Palmetto Ranch in 1865, my family ranch, near the coast. The French troops lined up along the riverbank across from family ranch and cheered the Confederacy to victory. The Confederate Army, some 6 weeks after the Appomattox, won that battle. When I was a schoolboy in Brownsville, we were taught that the battle took place because the Union general had not received word of the end of the war. We know now that that's totally untrue. Both sides were fighting for the control of the customs house at Matamoros and the probability of gaining tremendous fortune from the cotton trade. Support for the Confederacy in Brownsville continued well into the 20th century. And that can be seen by the historic event some of you may know about it took place in Brownsville called the Brownsville Raid in 1906, when African-American troops were blamed for shooting up the town, which they did not do, and were unjustly expelled from the army. The battlefield of Palmetto Ranch is today owned by my cousins and me, and is a family land heritage site. The area is historically significant for several reasons. Not only the participation of hundreds of African-American soldiers, sometimes called Buffalo Soldiers, and common ghastly apparitions at the ranch, similar to very many other Civil War battlefields in the South. The French troops subsequently marched down the coast from the port of Baghdad, which is no longer there, on the coast to Veracruz, from where they sailed back to France. Many deserted and remained in Mexico, and the remainder returned to France. Mexico endured political chaos from 1867 to 1876, when Porfirio Diaz became Emperor of Mexico, ruling Mexico with an iron fist for 35 years, from 1876 to 1911. His period of rule is referred to as the Porfiriato, the rule of Porfirio, was marked by great progress and modernization, and the Mexican economy finally boomed. However, his rule was ended by the Mexican Revolution of 1910 with the battle cry, "Land and Liberty." Well, in summary, we can see that the problems that existed between France and Mexico, and England and Mexico, and Spain and Mexico, and then the division of the political factions in the country, led to almost a century of political instability. Mexico was ripe for the taking, and many tried. The United States actually was able to overcome Mexico and acquired the land, as you know, all the way to California. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 took advantage and created a weak form of stability and distribution of land to peasants. That was the promise of the Mexican Revolution, was land for the peasants. Mexico celebrates many political and military victories and heroes, but the Cinco de Mayo is generally not one of them. Why are we having these fiestas tomorrow, these parties, and in Austin and LA and San Antonio and many other places. I can tell you because I was there. The Latino movement of the 1960s, led by university students and faculty, university faculty, and many others, were attempting to establish cultural identity associated with Mexico as the Mexican population in the United States grew with thousands of braceros, farm workers, and others in the 1960s. And so they were looking for opportunities to support Mexican history and Mexican culture. And the Cinco de Mayo is one of those. Another example is the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, which is not really understood, excuse me, except for an opportunity to have a party. Today, there are many celebrations. Tomorrow, there's going to be many celebrations of Cinco de Mayo in Hispanic communities throughout the United States, but few people who are celebrating know what the celebration represents. They think that it is Mexican Independence Day, which of course is not true. It's an opportunity to, which is not bad, nothing wrong with an opportunity to honor Mexican cultural history and pride. That's not bad, but I think it's important that the truth of the matter be told. And that concludes my presentation. I thank you very, very much for listening to that, my take on it, and I'll be happy to answer any questions there if there are some. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this. Okay. Okay, Jorge Luna says, in el barrio de Peñón de los Baños, a un lado, one to the side of the airport de Ciudad de Mexico, se celebra con great celebration the Battle of Puebla. Well, I'm happy to hear that. Jorge Luna also says, Ignacio Zaragoza nació en territorio mexicano de la Isla del Padre. That's not true, that's false. Ignacio Zaragoza was born in East Texas in the forts of La Bahia, but then his family moved back to Monterrey, where he grew up. Eric Delgado asks, why did a lot of families change their last name during the wars? Well, I don't know about that. Why did a lot of families change? I don't know. I'm very proud of my last name. I don't know. There's always been, as Mexican families and others, it's not just Mexican families, move into the United States, they often, quote unquote, anglicize their surnames. That's very, very common. And so it just makes it, in their mind, easier for them to exist and to live. And I think that's the reason. So let's see, are there any other questions out there? Okay, Laura Martinez, here we go. Just say thanks to Dr. Zavaleta for being the real history of the Cinco de Mayo, for bringing the real history of the Cinco de Mayo. I absolutely agree. In Mexico, just Puebla Estate celebrate this event. Thank you, Laura. That's exactly true. The Cinco de Mayo is not a major Mexican holiday. The Dia de los Muertos is, but Puebla is not. It should be. I mean, one of the things that you have to admire Mexico about is in their elementary schools, they teach their history to their students. And you talk to any, excuse me, Mexican elementary school student, and they know all about it. Ryan Allen asks, when did the French first come to Mexico? And that was in around 1861, maybe even 1860, because they landed at Veracruz and were camped there for almost a year before the decision was made, because there was a negotiation going on between the English, the Spanish, and the French to see what they were going to do. And so then finally, when the English and the Spanish decided to withdraw, the French moved forward. So that was about 1861, the battle, or 1862, because the Battle of Puebla was in 1862. Don't be bashful. Anybody else? Well, I've enjoyed, let's see. Here's an anonymous attendee. Do you have any reading recommendations for this chapter of, let's see, this thing got in the way, of Mexican history? There are many. I don't have anyone in particular, but I think that I would ask you, I should have prepared for that question, but if you go online, you'll find, and and there are a number of books that deal with the French intervention, and you'll be able to find them there. I'm sorry, I apologize that I don't have a recommendation. Laura Martinez says, my best friend is from Puebla, and she told me about the parades and the big parties in the schools in Puebla. I'm from Monterrey, in the north of the country, and exactly, we don't celebrate it. That's right. No, it's a huge, but you know, throughout Mexico, wherever there were historic events, like a good example is in the state of Guanajuato, where Dolores Hidalgo is in San Miguel de Allende, are located. Those events, the event of the Grito de Dolores, Mexican Independence Day, is cause for huge, enormous celebrations and parties. Okay. Well,
So it sounds like oh wait, one more question just.
oh, okay, where is that?
When exactly does the war with the United States start?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Tanny. The war with the United States, the so-called Mexican-American War, began in 1845. It's interesting because President Polk sent General Zachary Taylor, and the Army to Corpus Christi, Texas, which is 115 miles north of Brownsville, north of where the border is today, and asked them to stand by. When they got the word, General Zachary Taylor and his army marched down to Port Isabel, Texas. It wasn't then, but it is now, Port Isabel, Texas. Zachary Taylor sent a detachment from his army from Port Isabel to where Brownsville is today. There was no Brownsville. Across from Matamoros, literally to pick a fight. That's about 20 miles from the coast to Brownsville. And that's what they did. They picked a fight, and then that's where the famous statement comes from, American blood has been shed on American soil, or something like that. And the United States declared war on Mexico. They marched to Monterrey, Saltillo, and to Mexico City. So it began in 1845. It ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It's Elisa Dueñas. Why did the French want to go to Puebla? They didn't want to go to Puebla. Puebla was they wanted to go to Mexico City, but the capital. But the only road, I know it's hard, you got to look at the map. There's huge mountains there. And the only road at that time from the coast where their ships came in to Mexico City was through Puebla. They had to go through Puebla. So that's why. And then Joseph Jackie says, can you talk about why the Mexican attacked Puebla instead of somewhere else in Mexico? Well, as I described earlier in my presentation, Mexico City, what we know today as Mexico City, was the center of everything, the center of government, the center of finance, the center of religion. And so they knew, the French knew that by taking Mexico City, which would have been a very simple thing to do, it was, they would, for all practical purposes, have conquered Mexico. And that's what they did. So Tanny says, questions. So was this the same time as yes, this is French intervention. The French intervention began in 1861 and lasted through 1865 when Maximilian was executed. Eric Delgado graduated from Fort Ringgold, which is Ringgold High School, that in Rio Grande City, Texas. What is the importance of the fort? Well, it has huge historic importance, Eric, because as the American Army traveled along the border from Brownsville, then to Rio Grande City, and then across country to Saltillo, they created these forts. And Fort Ringgold was the second fort to be built on the Rio Grande River and on the international border. And it's just an absolutely fabulous place. They have preserved many more of the buildings, as you know, at Fort Ringgold than we have at Fort Brown, lamentably. Irma Santana asked, why is it called the Mexican-American War while Mexico was part of America? Okay, I'm not sure I understand. It was the war, it was called the Mexican-American War because America, the United States of America, I understand what you're saying, that Mexico is part of America, but that's what it's called by the historians. The United States, we should say, invaded Mexico. Mexico is also a part of America. I understand what you're saying, Edwin. You're very correct there. Anonymous asks, does the fight with the United States predate the so-called Anahuac disturbances? I don't know. I wish I could tell you, but I'm not sure about that. Jose Aguilar writes, back in the 70s, there used to be a parade in Mexico City from the Zócalo, which is the center to Chapultepec Park, on that Chapultepec Castle. On that day, young men doing their military service were sworn as Mexicans. It was, however, discontinued sometime later on. She doesn't know exactly when, or he doesn't know exactly when. Cinco de Mayo and Primero de Mayo are big dates in Mexico. Well, I don't agree. Tell me how many celebrations there's going to be tomorrow. Not many. Can we say that, Tani asks, can we say that Mexico won the battle, but in reality lost in terms of numbers and assets? Yes, Mexico miraculously won the first battle of Puebla, but lost, the French returned in a year later with 38,000 troops. I mean, that's a massive, and Mexico could not withstand that attack. And so Mexico did lose in terms of numbers, assets, and everything else. So in which terms did Mexico win? They won the battle, and that's about all. Elisa Dueña says, I really appreciate you doing this. A lot of people don't know the story of Puebla. Thank you, Elisa. I enjoyed doing it for you very much. And Ryan says, did Germany have anything to do with any of this? Well, indirectly they did, because remember, the Emperor Maximilian, I'm going to tell you a little story in a minute. The Emperor Maximilian in Mexico was supported, the only reason he could be there was he was supported by French troops. But his cousin, Napoleon III, withdrew the troops because he needed them for the Franco-German War, which was about to take place. So indirectly, Germany did. When I visited, you know, I'm very patriotic. I'm a proud American, but I have hundreds of years of Mexican history in my family. My family has literally been on the Rio Grande River since 1600. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. When I went to the museum, the main museum in Austria, went into the museum, there was this fantastic Aztec headdress. And it said that this headdress had been brought from Mexico by the Emperor Maximilian for Austria. And that was cause for, I mean, I haven't gotten over that yet, because I think it's not going to ever be returned to Mexico, but it should be. It should be returned in Mexico. In the National Museum of Anthropology and History in Mexico City, where I've spoken, the headdress that they have there is a copy. The real one is in Vienna. Okay, Ana Rodriguez. What are some good, I'm sorry, there you go. History books and reading material that you recommend to learn more about? Well, there are many. There are in English or Spanish. There are many, many, many very good. I think the best are written in Spanish. The Mexicans have done a lot of work in their history for many, many years. But I'm not I'm sorry, I apologize. I should have anticipated this question, but I didn't. So I can't tell you what, I mean, you can find, I think if you go online, and certainly I think you'll find much information. Okay.
Okay, so it looks like we have covered all of our Q&As.
Yeah, that was fun.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zavaleta.
You're most welcome. And
time.
the 16 chat, what is that about?
Oh, so people just there's some comments in the chat.
Oh, okay. Well, can I look at those?
Yeah.
Huh?
And we can email the attendees if you would like to, Dr. Zavaleta, make a list of some books.
Well, I think
we could email it to people.
I think what you could do is give the attendees my email address, and I will do any research that I failed to do, I will do for them and make recommendations on what they could read. We can do that. Okay. And if you want to send if you just send me a list of attendees, that's not going to be helpful. But those people that have a question could email me. Okay, are we done? That was great. I appreciate it very much. What do you think?
Appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Did it work? How about our interpreter? How did she do? Emily, I guess she's not there, but I guess. Okay, I'm gonna sign off.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Zavaleta.
Okay, you're very welcome.
Appreciate your time.
You're certainly welcome. Hi, Emily. Okay, good. Very good. And María?
Pero creo que todo el mundo se va a despedir.
Okay, thank you.
Adiós a todos. Happy 5 de Mayo.
Feliz 5 de Mayo a todo el mundo.
Así es.